Welcome to the Protecting the Shield podcast. It's an absolute honor to have Matthew Fyles here with us today. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you, Adam. Pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to be at the table.
Excellent. We're going to have a good conversation today about all things health and wellness and law enforcement and public safety. Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so obviously, we've known each other for some time now, and you're familiar with my background, but maybe listeners obviously won't be. My history is really in law enforcement. I began my career in 2003 out here in Aurora, Colorado with the Aurora Police Department and started out there like every officer does on patrol and kind of worked my way up through the ranks. Had the fortunate opportunity to partner with a company to build a software solution for law enforcement kind of late in my career. And it was specific to investigations because the majority of my career was spent in investigations. And through that partnership, we created a product, went to market. Ultimately, I retired in very end of 2019 from the Aurora Police Department to focus full time on the business venture, and been doing that for the last 6 years. And so it's been a bit of a wild ride. I didn't think I would ever do all the things I've done. My career in law enforcement was anomalous. It wasn't something that was common when I think about it in comparison to a lot of other officers. But even though I had sort of kind of a unnatural trajectory, I experienced a lot of the same things every officer experiences, regardless of what they do, for their department and their community. So, yeah, it's been an interesting journey to say the least.
So tell us about your career on. Remind the listeners the year and what was it like, your training and things like that.
Yeah, so every officer, I went through the police academy, and Aurora Police Department's one of the large agencies in North American municipalities, and so we had our own academy that they would put folks through. So back in 2003, at the ripe age of 25, I entered the academy and went through that process, and that was a 6 month long academy where you're trained in everything, right? From interview, interrogation, the criminal statutes, search and seizure, officer safety, arrest control, driving, shooting, everything that goes into being a cop, right? Preparing you, building that muscle memory. And it was like I said, 6 month process, and it was paramilitary style. So, we were dressed in something very similar to what I'm wearing today. And, it was a lot of sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, bracing, all of those types of things that are familiar to, folks that have a military background. And eventually, you develop enough independence as a group that you start to get to wear the blues and be treated a little bit more like officers, even though you haven't even actually stepped out on the streets. So it was an interesting experience. I actually enjoyed the academy. I thought it was really a great place to be. And we got a lot of education early on, about what to expect. And even though back then, they did their best to prepare you for kind of what you were about to get into. My experience was, that they had tools that they had at the time, which is really just word of mouth pieces of wisdom and, encouragement to take that wisdom and apply it in life. However, a lot of us experience a lot of the difficulties in this profession, even having been told ahead of times. It's like having a child and you're trying to educate them and tell them, all the great things that you've learned in life so that they don't have to experience them themselves, and then they just go out and make all the same mistakes anyways.
So that's interesting in learning and anticipating some of the stressors that you might face on the job, right? There's only so far you can go in the academy, but what were some of the types of things that you would experience in the academy that might have been stressful in the academy itself?
Yeah, I think folks that don't have maybe a background in team sports or sports in general, where you have a lot of regiment to what you're doing. Maybe you have a coach or coaches, and you have that kind of instilled that routine, or they don't have a military background, right? When you come into a paramilitary style, you're shaving your head, you're all dressed the same, you're just a recruit. You're screamed at, yelled at, and it's all part of the process of breaking you down, building you back up, helping develop that team member perspective, right? Because you're gonna have to rely on these other officers and all of your fellow officers when you get out on the streets. And then again, it's very structured, right? You have the schedule that you have to follow, and then there's PT, and then there's discipline in the form of PT. So when you do something wrong, which inevitably you will, or they'll find a reason to PT you, you get PT'd, and so you have that physical stress, you have this situational stress, you have the stress of passing tests, right? So that you're certified ultimately. And some of those are, they're basically gateways. If you don't pass that test at that particular skill set at that particular time, you're washed out, and it's reapply, good luck. And so there's the stress of that, right? That in this one moment, this function, whether it's shooting or arrest control or something or driving, if I don't pass this test, I don't have a job as soon as I finish it and fail it, right? And so that's a lot of stress too. There's not a lot of professions where, in that moment, if you don't perform, you're gone.
Yeah. So looking back at it, 23 years later, the whole concept of breaking down to build up and the pressure that you're mentioning, it did it ultimately, was that the best way to do it? How do you think about it now?
Yeah, I'm a Gen Xer. So,
Yeah.
I saw a meme recently where it's Gen Xers, like Gen Z, Millennials are nicer, and Gen X is like destroy your enemies. And so for me, the concept, felt very good. I played sports all my life. I grew up with a father that was in the military, a lot of family members in military, a lot of family members in law enforcement. And so, I was okay with it. It didn't bother me. There were moments of stress for sure, but I liked it. I think still to this day, it's a proven model for the military and for law enforcement to develop that resilience for the things that they're going to have to face and deal with, and then to build that camaraderie and instill that sense of duty, to be there for your fellow officers, and then also, the confidence to rely on that expectation that they'll be there for you as well. And so I think it's absolutely imperative that the paramilitary style stay in place and utilized in law enforcement, even though it's a stressful thing. It's good. It's preparing people for the stress of the job as best we can, right? In a kind of vacuum.
Got it. So walk me through, you graduate the academy,
Mm.
field training. Walk me through some of the experiences there that may have stayed with you as it relates to stress and health and wellness.
Yeah, well, I was a cheater. I policed in the city I grew up in, so I knew the city really well, and the old part of the city, grid layout, the south part of the city, it was a mess of streets. And I remember, going into the FTO, we knew who the hatchets were, and when I say the hatchets, these are the field training officers that had been designated as the officers that got rid of recruits that shouldn't be police officers or weren't performing. And so I immediately was told I was going to get the hatchet on the in District 2. And District 2 was also geographically the hardest district to maneuver and navigate in because it wasn't grid. And I remember telling my PTO, my police training instructor officer, that, I'm getting the hatchet, and he says, and he was a Chicago guy, and he, pushes up his glasses. Fyles, you're the only guy I know that can survive the hatchet in District 2. And he meant like get around and not be overstressed by this particular FTO. And so, that was my cycle one FTO, which was also my test out FTO. And so you get out there and you're just brand new, and they're turning up. You're like the frog in the pot, they're turning up the heat. And they would do things to you to increase the stress. The radio call would come out, you'd have your MDC, and the MDC had navigation even back then, GPS. And my FTO would immediately shut my computer so that I couldn't see the road map. And then he would turn up the in-car radio station, right? So that I had that distraction. I couldn't navigate with the computer, and I had to figure it all out. And so, it's this gauntlet, really, um, that recruits are faced with. And again, it's just another form of preparation for you to be on your own. But it is a pressure cooker.
Yeah, first of all, your Chicago accent sounds very authentic. I'm more of a New York area guy, but I would have believed it. I don't know if any of the other listeners, in terms of that gauntlet and learning from experience, it sounded like, because had you spent any time in the hatchet, coming up prior to being part of the police department? Was it, even though you policed in the town you were from, was the hatchet like a new town for you, or?
No, it was actually we policed the neighborhood I grew up in.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So again, like I said, this was a strategy by my PTO to say, this particular FTO creates a lot of stress. I've got a recruit that is he demonstrated a fair level of resilience in the academy. He also grew up here. He knows that area. He'll survive first cycle with the hatchet probably better than anybody else in this recruit class. And we had about 46 recruits in my class. And so it was sort of like one of those things that I realized too. It's my kind of cross to bear, so to say, right? I can take on the hatchet in first cycle. Everybody else will get other PTOs or FTOs that might be a little easier. They will get their feet underneath them in first cycle. I'll survive this guy. It won't be a problem, right? Like there's just only success. There's no failure, and it was a little easier because, of course, when those calls come out, I generally knew the area. I could get to it without having the map on the computer screen telling me, which turn to take and all of that. And so I could just focus on the particulars coming across the radio and practice my officer safety and those types of things. Yeah, so there was a lot of strategy that went into it that I
That's
realized.
great. You were solid, thinking about resilience and the fit for the job. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even at a young age, I mean, when we were in the academy, and this is going to be kind of you know, it may be a little rough for, this day and age. But, the piece of advice, especially when I share it, you'll recognize it comes from a bygone era. But we had a division chief that came in and he told us two important things. The first one was you always go home and we don't fight fair because we have to go home, right? So and nobody expects this fight to be fair. So make sure that you take care of yourselves and your other officers and get home safely. And then his other piece of advice was beware of the three B's. And the three B's were broads. There's the archaic component, right? Broads, bullets, and booze. And so the idea of being resilient, the idea of being on guard for things that can creep into your life and cause you a lot of problems in this particular profession, that was being voiced to us from, the very beginning.
Now, Matt, when you came to this profession, I know you have an interesting academic background.
Mm.
Was that prior to the profession, to being on the job, or while you were on the job?
Yeah, yeah. So, well, as you know, I was in sciences. So I got my undergrad degree in zoology from Colorado State University. Worked in a lot of research while I was in undergrad. Passed up graduate school at that time with my advisor to follow my wife out to California. I ended up at the University of Southern California, managing a research lab and working on graduate degree in neuroscience. And when you're young and you don't realize that the world turns on the dollar, and you need those to pay your bills, being in academia for another, 4 to 8 years before I could actually earn a living was a little bit of a turnoff. And all of my family, like I said, military, and I had a number of cousins. My brother would ultimately go into law enforcement as well. And so it was just a natural kind of thing. I'd always talked about doing it, and it just became the path for me. I realized I'd rather pursue that career than continue in my graduate studies. And so I left USC to become a police officer. Yeah.
And when in your career you mentioned that you had an injury that your neuroscience knowledge may have helped you through that in some ways, but could you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's an ironic thing, isn't it, right? You go to school for neuroscience and then you get a traumatic brain injury. Yeah, I was new in my career too, and so I I've thought about it, whether it was good that it happened early on or whether it was bad that it happened early on. But I was essentially just shy of a year out on my own from FTO. So I'd gone to the academy and went through the 3 months of FTO. I'm now my own officer out on the street, learning still as I go. And we were closing down a highway, the highway through one of the major highways through Aurora because of a flash freeze that happened at the end of April into May. And it just like iced up the entire roadways. There were tons of crashes on the highway. Everything was getting locked down. And I was two-man, got out to, retrieve flares from our cruiser and just slipped on the ice. And there's nothing sexy about the story. I just fell and I just happened to be close enough to the vehicle that I struck my head on the car. And then other officers saw me hit my head on the trunk and then on the concrete because the first impact had knocked me unconscious. And I don't remember any of this. This is all told to me by the officers that were on scene. But ultimately, I was unconscious. I was bleeding because I had punctured my face. And when I came to, it was very evident to them that things weren't right. I was combative. I wasn't talking in the way that I normally would, and so fire and rescue was called, and I was transported to a hospital. And ultimately, what was determined was that I sustained a closed head brain injury, and ultimately it would lead to a really difficult time and long road back. It was pretty devastating.
Uh, Absolutely. Tell us about that road back. What made that harder or easier? Who was on it with you?
Yeah, I think I think all of it was hard. I think the silver lining when I think about it was, when officers get hurt on the job, and especially back then, but I'd say even today, right? There's this whole workers' compensation apparatus that gets initiated, and for injuries like, my back is hurt, shoulders hurt, knees hurt, broken hands, things like that. There's this sort of like typical cycle that officers find themselves in. For me, having a brain injury, it was such a unique and obviously significant injury that I think the city, they recognized that, and I actually got very good care. The care I got was excellent. And I say that because oftentimes what officers experience is this, let's PT, let's do the minimum to get you back on the road and back to work. The problem is sometimes that solution, that approach of do the minimum, only draws out the injury. And by the time they recognize that the minimum isn't going to work, right? You've had atrophy of the injured area. What could have been fixed with a surgery early on with a faster healing cycle, right, is now, a really deteriorated joint. The tissue's atrophied and bad, and then it prolongs their recovery there, and it's a really nasty cycle. For me, I got really great care. Out here in Colorado, there's a place called Craig Hospital, and it's kind of the place for brain injuries in the region. And so I had an incredible neurologist and team that, ultimately diagnosed me and then treated me. So I had vestibular therapy because I had extreme vertigo and I had a nystagmus as a result of the injury. My vision was changing over time because of the damage to the brain. The vestibular therapy helps with balance and kind of, my gait was off when I walked, so restoring my ability to walk correctly. And then I had just physical therapy as well. I took time for my brain to heal enough. I struggled with words like verbalizing, what I was thinking, feeling, trying to say. So for me, language was affected, and that's a product of my diagnosis, which is a form of epilepsy called pseudobulbar palsy, and it's a super rare form, but it affects like your ability to speak. It affects your ability to swallow, and then some of these other things. It also creates emotional incontinence, which is a kind of a neat term, right? It means that incontinence, like wetting yourself. I emotionally wet myself. So,
Give us
crying.
an example of that.
Yeah, it would be like crying for no reason, like hysterically crying, sobbing, and then immediately it stops, and then it starts again, and then it stops, or hysterical laughter, and for no reason or at inappropriate times. So somebody says, oh, Aunt Jane passed away, and I start laughing hysterically. And, people look at you like, what is wrong with you as a human being that you would laugh about something like that? And it's like I can't control it, right? It's outside of my ability. So it was affecting my affect. I had memory issues originally. So I had a daughter that was only my daughter was only a month old, 2 months old at the time, my first and only child, and I don't remember her from about that 2 month mark when I had the injury until she was about 6 months old. And so lost time there. Again, my affect, I was, kind of aggressive verbally and frustrated. And so it would come out as being short with people like my wife and family members. And it was awful, sedentary. So I lost a lot of weight. Wasn't able to do the things I enjoyed. Yeah, it was awful.
Wow. So during this time, were you working? Were you not working? What when was the transition like?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, for us in Colorado, and this is a uniqueness of law enforcement, right? Is every state, every city, every county is, its own government. And so, things are different, from one city to the next, and you can share a border. But for us, we receive, I had bought insurance. They told us in the academy, hey, you should get disability insurance. And that's a red flag. Like, hey, you should totally invest in disability insurance because you're going to get broken up in this job.
Hmm.
And, I thought, oh, I might get in a car wreck or I might, get in a fight and break a hand or something. And those things happened, of course. But I didn't anticipate a traumatic brain injury. And so my disability insurance paid me, a disability monthly stipend while I was out of work. And then the city in Colorado, in Aurora, paid me my salary while I was on light duty. So financially, I didn't feel an impact from this injury. But that's not the case for a lot of law enforcement. They'll actually see a reduction in their pay while they're sitting at home healing. So it's like insult to injury. You've been injured on the job and now you're going to make less money while you're trying to heal and get back to work. And now you're trying to get back to work sooner than later because financially, I didn't have that pressure, thank goodness. Um, but I'm sitting at home, for effectively I was at home on a leave for it was about 7 months, and then they brought me back to light duty. And so light duty is effectively like a desk job, right? You're not out enforcement, you're not in uniform. Because of my brain injury, the doctor's recommendations, it was light duty only part time. So I was only coming in for 20 hours a week. And I was doing like minimal tasks, just answering the phone. And what we found was, that was too much for my brain. And eventually they said, you know what, he's not healed enough to even do that. So they brought me back home and I stayed at home for another few months. And then I came back again, part-time light duty, and I worked myself up to full-time light duty. And I was released back to the streets at about 10 months to almost 11 months. And um, it was, wouldn't fly today. So today you're either full duty or you're not. And full duty means you can do everything that your job requires. Back then, they said he's full duty, but he has restrictions. And and I was in full uniform with a gun, out policing. My restrictions were I could not drive and I could not be by myself. So yeah, yeah. What sense does that make, right? That I have this injury that prevents me from being on my own. It also prevents me from operating a car, but sure, be armed with a handgun, go out and arrest people. And the saving grace, it's kind of scary, was that we got into a fight with a parolee and I broke my hand. And I ended up going back on my duty for my hand because it needed to heal or I was in a cast. But it was a godsend because I was not I should not have been on the road in that condition, and I needed more time to heal because I was effectively going to work, working my 10-hour shift. We worked 4 10s, and I would come home and I would go to bed and I would sleep until about an hour and 15 minutes before my next shift. And I'd have to like drag myself out of bed with an alarm because my brain was so fatigued. And I'd get myself back together, eat a little something, put on my uniform, go back to work. And so it was a real blessing to have had that other injury, to have bought myself some more time to heal up.
So, wow. So bring us forward because I know that you went on to how long was your career?
Yeah, just shy of 17 years.
Yeah, 17-year career, including and we'll get to some of the things that you got involved with, which are quite incredible and quite stressful in and of themselves, and when we get there. But help me help the people listening to this understand, the rest of the path to get you back into full duty. What was it like? What happened? Who helped you, if anybody? You know,
Yeah. Well, I ended up healing my hand up and then going back to patrol. I was still exhausted, so I was still doing the essentially shift to shift, come home, sleep. The hard part about that, of course, was, I had this young daughter, now about 2 years old, and I had a wife, and they expect you to be husband, father, right? Family expects you to be brother, son. Friends expect you to be, functional and engaged. And I was, working and sleeping, working and sleeping, working and sleeping. So, there's this pressure cooker that's starting to happen in my personal life. Additionally, the finance part is always a stress, for anybody, right? Most of us are independently wealthy. So, I think we had kind of gotten used to having that disability money, right? I'm getting that insurance money on top of my regular salary, and it's like you start to kind of live outside of your means, and then eventually that money stops, and you're just getting your base pay, right? But you've grown accustomed to living with that other money, which was a poor decision. So now we have, financial stress. Um, we get to a point in your recovery with any jurisdiction, any city, county, state, where they go, it's essentially the same term. It's called maximum medical improvement, MMI. And it means like, hey, you're as healed as you're ever going to get. And what they do at that point is they rate you with disability. And they say you're either you're either disabled to the point where you're not a cop anymore, or you're disabled to a lesser threshold, and then they pay you a lump sum. And most people think, ooh, a lump sum. But the cities there and the counties and states are trying to mitigate their loss, right? So they're interested to pay you as little as possible. And some folks get attorneys. I should have. I was young. They were also looking at medically retiring me because I was still struggling. And they thought, well, maybe his rating is to the point where he shouldn't be a police officer, which again is crazy. I'm out there on the streets now. You've put me back out there, but now you're talking about my disability being so great that maybe I shouldn't be a cop. And I remember haggling with the doctor saying, "Look, I'm 26 years old. I can't afford not to have a job. I need you to like rate me as high as you have to rate me, but low enough that I keep my job." I mean, what a unfortunate set of circumstance. And the doctor did, and I was able to like continue on. But I wasn't better. I wasn't really functioning fully again for probably 24 to 30 months after the injury. And of course, in all that time, all that stress has piled up, all that trauma for my family, for me, has compounded during that time. And um, I policed really aggressively. And, I chased everything, and I had some really good sergeants that were long in the tooth. They had been cops for a very long time, and they recognized that I had a particular way of policing. And then with my injury, and they pulled me aside and they said, "Look, um, you're a great road cop, but you're gonna end up gone or dead if you don't get off the road, because the road is inherently just full of these confrontations, right?" and they really pressured me to go into investigations, and I did not want to do it. That was not part of my blueprint. It wasn't what I wanted to do, but they were, guys I really respected, as supervisors, as cops, as men. And so I ended up taking the detectives test, and despite my best efforts, got promoted, So off the streets I went and into the detective bureau, which was a completely different life and a whole nother set of stressors and opportunities. So it was
How so? Compare and contrast some of the stressors of your patrol work to your early detective work.
yeah. Early detective work was a lot better than late in life detective work, based on the assignments I was in. So I went to property crimes, and it was a great place to go as a brand new detective. Most units have mottos, and we had one, and it said "Life counts, property costs more," and that's a little macabre. But it was a funny saying, right? Because there wasn't a lot of there's a lot, not a lot of focus or interest in property crimes, not because they're not important. It's just the volume, right? And in a city like Aurora, we were dealing with a lot of violent crime. And so, if you solved a property crime, cool, right? But the consequence for the perpetrator was almost assuredly probation. And so it was kind of like paper for paper's sake. But it was a good place to learn because patrol operations and policing, right, and law enforcement, the effort is kind of divided into operations and investigations. And operations is what we all, typically see, the first responders, it's going to the calls, it's triaging the call, it's dealing with it, taking the initial report, and they move on to the next one. And their work week starts, say, on a Monday and ends on a Thursday. And they go home and there's nothing waiting for them when they come back, right? They come back and they do it all over again and they do it all over again. In investigations, your work is waiting for you. You're thinking about it. You're like, oh, I need to call that victim back. I need to follow up on that, witness statement. I got to go retrieve that evidence that patrol didn't pick up. I've got to submit this request to have this forensic test done. Um, I need to write those reports, right, from the interviews I've already done. And you're managing your caseload. And then, you know, patrol has this expectation of kind of this level of understanding as it relates to search and seizure and interrogation and all of those things that go into our civil rights and what law enforcement can and can't do in investigations, right? That's like a whole nother level. And I always said like investigations was the SWAT of the paper and the effort to like document and produce probable cause, right? The equivalent of what SWAT is to operations, right? Which is all the special weapons and tactics for the initial response. And I wasn't prepared for that. You kind of land, and we had no formal training. That was a stress. You just got put in a desk and it's like, "Oh, here's your cases, kid, knock them out, And you're like, knock them out. I don't even know what program I'm using here for this, case writing. And and they're like, talk to that old guy over there that's crusty and mean to figure out how you're supposed to do your job. And you're like, okay, and the guy tells you when you're allowed to talk to him and when you're not. So yeah, it was a whole nother world.
How'd you get through it? Was the stress finding its way home? Like you said, you take some of the you're thinking about work outside of work, that kind of stuff. How'd you work through it?
Yeah, I went from on patrol being this, I want to be the best patrol officer I could possibly be. And when I was bidding shifts, my wife would say, bid that shift. And I'd bid the one that was the exciting shift, even though she just told me, hey, I need you to bid this one to be home. Because it was like, I'm going to be the best cop I can be, and that's going to help me do it. And then I go to investigations, and even though it's property crimes and nobody expects you to move, an earth for them. I just had that same motivation. And so it's like, I really want to work these cases. And, here we are in property crimes where most guys are filing they're working their cases from their desk, which is an approach, not a great one. And me and another guy just decided, hey, we're gonna like really work burglaries. And so we're working like burglary rings, fencing rings. We're doing surveillance we're utilizing other resources to help us, take down these organized groups. And it sounds really sexy, and we recovered, hundreds of thousands of dollars of property, but nobody really batted an eye, but it was fun, but it wasn't our banker's hours like all the other detectives were working, right? We're doing those and then we're doing surveillance at night and we're, arresting people and then having to do the interviews because we've got a ticking clock. And, I'm not home. Again, I'm not home. I'm not there to be present. Um, I'm now making overtime, a lot more overtime for investigations, which isn't as necessarily available on patrol. And so now I'm able to supplement the income, but financially we're still kind of living paycheck to paycheck, right? I make more, we consume more. And added stress is there. And I think I had this perspective of I needed to prove myself, right? I didn't have as much time on the road. 3.5 years on the road is not a lot of road time. And so I got to show and demonstrate that I'm a good cop, right? Even though I'm not on the streets anymore, I'm going to build my investigative cred.
Got it. Did it show up in, you mentioned some of the fun things that you were doing. Did it show up in clearance rates? Because I know clearance rates can be really low in property crimes, and there's room to make a difference there.
Yeah, yeah. Historically, when you're talking about burglaries, across the nation, back then the closure rate, because of course I looked into that, I want to be the best I can be. So the closure rate was roughly across the nation about 35% on burglaries. Um, and so I was like, well, I want to be better than that. So not only did I take more cases within my cadre, I cleared more. So I was sitting at about 65% clearance rate on my cases.
Wow.
Um,
How about solve rate?
yeah, it was great, and out of all of those, I think only one guy did prison time. But that's a narrative on the,
Wow.
on the justice system.
Well, that impacts health and wellness too, right? If you're if you're doing the work and at on the back end, well, you tell me.
Yeah, I mean, you have this kind of perspective of I'm doing all this hard work, right? And then this guy walks out the door with I arrest him, I bond him. Um, he makes bond. The bond's super low because it's property crime, and he's out there. I arrest him today, and he's doing a burglary tomorrow. Um, Really, really difficult. And the one case where I got one guy that ended up doing actual prison time in Department of Corrections, he was a multi-convicted felon. Burglary was his game. I did a large multi-jurisdictional filing, what we call global filing, on him because he had committed so many burglaries in the metropolitan area. He actually fled, was chased by helicopter by Mesa PD in Arizona. Ultimately, we caught him with family out in Kansas. And I leveraged something we call in Colorado the big bitch. And that was if you had so many felonies, you could bitch them. And so I bitched him. And then for a plea deal, he said, I'll do 9 years in Department of Corrections as opposed to the big bitch, which would have got him 35 years, right? So he took a plea deal. So even then, right, he goes to prison. I didn't even go to trial. As a property detective, I went to one trial out of all my cases. And I was in that unit for about 2 years. And I filed just shy of 100 cases, and only one went to trial.
Wow.
Yeah, because they all got pled out. So you're doing all this work just for them to, do some horse trading with the defense attorney, and the person walks out the door. And so I at that time, I mean, I didn't realize how much of a meat grinder being in trial really was, and the stress and the difficulties that I had no concept as a property detective. And I was, fat, dumb, and happy. I'm filing my cases. I wanted them to have more time. I wanted them to be, a little bit more punitive action. But, I was also learning and having fun and doing the surveillance part. So I still kind of felt like a bit of a hot shot.
So tell me about your next step after property crimes. What caused it? Where'd you go next?
I went to the gang unit, and I never wanted to go to gangs. Um, because to me it was like, well, I'm policing a population that victimizes a lot of people, and yes, they're victims, but like I really want to help, the true innocent victim, right? The person that's just trying to go to work and gets victimized. Gangs, they kind of live by the sword, die by it, and so I was just like, not a group I really wanted to spend a lot of time on. But the gang unit had taken notice of my clearance rates and property, and they're like, "This is a young up and comer, right? He's a good young puncher. We can bring him up here, and he'll do good work." And so I started to get recruited for gangs, and I was kind of off put by the idea, but then I found out that they got hazard pay, and which again, another red flag, like get disability kit because you're going to need it. You're going to get broken. Hey, here's hazard pay because your chances of getting shot have just gone up, exponentially. And this is going to be wild, but a lot of listeners will probably be able to relate to it. It was $500 extra a year for hazard pay. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I got a take home car. I was like, man, I'm in the money because now I got a take home car. I'm on call. I get on call pay. I got hazard pay. Like I'm Daddy Warbucks here and life is good. And I went up to gangs and it was awesome because it we were out on the streets. We were in soft uniforms, so BDUs, polos. We look different from everybody else because gangsters will treat gang officers differently than they treat regular officers. And we're out dealing with the worst of the worst. And I thought, man, how did I ever get this so wrong? This is like hair on fire, tons of fun. I'm getting to be a little bit more operational. Um, and we're targeting really bad people doing really bad things. And we kind of initiated a partnership with ATF. We had a really great partner that had been an Aurora officer. He first was the LAPD, then he was Aurora, then he went to ATF, then he came back to Colorado. And it was like the early efforts of like leveraging the federal system as it related to crime guns and guns used in violence. And we were just having a blast, dismantling gangs. And I was like, this is incredible. But again, banker's hours as a detective, but then all of our operations are in the evening and we're hitting houses on search warrants, we're running flushes and buying busts and things like that. And, I'm working 15 hours a day and I'm not home. And, again, the pressure on my personal life is just like, that frog in a pot. It's getting hotter and hotter. It's starting to boil.
Were there still effects of the traumatic brain injury?
Yeah. I mean, people have always said that my personality changed and I was a little bit more rough around the edges, and I remember having a disagreement with some narcotics officers, and to the point where it deteriorated to, hey, why don't you guys come on over here and the three of us will figure this out, behind the building. And, you think about that and people are going to be like, oh my gosh, right? Now, other law enforcement will be like, oh yeah, I get that, right? To the point where you're like challenging your coworkers to fistfights is a red flag, another red flag, right? That something's going wrong. And it was just the pressure that I was experiencing. My personal life was really starting to kind of fall apart at that point. And um, I had the pressures of doing good work in the gang unit, right? These cases now started to matter more. They were going to court more often. I was getting the experience of being brought in on a preliminary hearing and really, put through the ringer there. And then a motions hearing later about an interview or a photo lineup where they're really attacking your work. And then I finally started to go to trial more. And I'm like, man, this is really, really, you know, serious work and I don't want my credibility destroyed. I was doing work legitimately, but they attack you, right? As your credibility as an investigator. And of course, the fear of becoming Brady'd. They find something, I forgot something. There's a discovery violation and a sanction. And so all of this is just combining to create this really, really toxic situation.
So you're firing on all cylinders, 15 hours a day, all this pressure, and you have a traumatic brain injury, personal life, all of that. In those moments, in that part of your career when you were doing gangs, did you start paying attention? Because to sleep, to food, to exercise, to any of that? Because I know you eventually do, but when do you start paying attention to that?
Yeah, so I'd grown up like really active playing sports and working out. And so like lifting weights was something I did. I had an older brother and these older cousins, and they were always lifting because a lot of them were in law enforcement, military. And so, as a grade schooler, I was lifting weights in the basement like some little prisoner, out in the yard. And that was always part of who I was, but my diet wasn't dialed in, my finances weren't dialed in, my sleep wasn't dialed in, like all these other things. So I was always working out. Once I recovered enough from the brain injury to be able to go to the gym, I was going to the gym. That part was still there. So I was hitting the gym every day, and that was and always has been my greatest coping skill is going in and getting that physical activity and keeping my body as in shape as possible. But even that has evolved over the years, as you know. That was all I was doing. I mean, I was eating whatever I packed, if I packed anything. Most of what I packed, I was taking like, TV dinners because I could throw them in the microwave and they'd sit in the freezer well. I was eating out most of the time as a group. We were out running ops, and we call it narc time, right? Everything happens on narc time. And so you kind of eat when you can, right? And you eat what's available. And, luckily at that point we were swing shifts, so there were still like restaurants open. It wasn't like you're eating the hot dog off of the vending machine at the 7-Eleven, but um my sleep was completely disrupted because I had to be available during banker's hours, whereas the rest of the gang unit, the myself and my other detective, we were banker's hours. The rest of the unit was a swing shift. So I'd work my banker's hours and then I'd stay on later into the night to work with them on the buy and bus and things like that. So, I'd finally go home at 3 in the morning and I'd have to be back at work at 9. So yeah, sleep was shot. And I started to work off duty. So this is insane. So on my days off, I'm working off duty shifts, providing security at an apartment complex, or, working a bank job where you sit at a bank for the day as armed security, or I was, working traffic control at a construction site. I mean, and this is not abnormal, Adam, as you know. This is like what every officer is doing.
At this time, how old are you? How old's your daughter at this point?
Gosh, at this point, she was probably 5, 6, 5. She was 5. Yeah. Um, yeah, probably when I went to gangs, she was 4. And when I was getting close to leaving gangs, she was 5.
Got it. So you're in gangs, and you. I know you get to homicide. Do you go right to homicide from gangs, or is there something between?
No, I went right to homicide. So homicide was a coveted assignment. We supported homicide quite a bit in gangs, and I recognized early on that's not an assignment I want to do ever. Because I thought I worked a
The
lot and I
theme here. There's a theme here.
right. Everything I say I didn't want to do, I did. I need to start saying I don't want to be independently wealthy. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't want to be 6'4". Um, yeah, it was an assignment that I had seen through our support of the homicide unit because we had so many gang related murders that man, these guys are working all the time. Even with the amount I was working, I was like, no way, man. And I knew that those cases were really scrutinized, and I was already experiencing a higher level of scrutiny from the gang cases. And I'm like, I don't ever want to do that. And so I'm literally driving to a smoker one night, me and another gang guy. And a smoker is, where the police and the fire department get together and beat the hell out of each other in the ring. And, we raise money and cops drink a lot, and inevitably some cops get in fights in the audience. It's a great time. And as I'm driving to the smoker, my gang sergeant calls me and says, "Hey, you're going to get a call from the homicide sergeant." And the homicide sergeant was this really fantastic guy. His name was Rodolfo Herrera, and just an incredible, incredible guy. He was a Cuban refugee, and he was Cuban smooth, handsome. I mean, you love this guy. He could talk you into anything. He calls me, or I call him, and he answers, and he says, "Hey, Manny, how you doing?" He had this kind of like, voice. And I said, "Hey, Sarge, I was told to give you a call." And he says, basically, the short of it is, he says, "I want you to come talk to us about homicide." And I remember like looking at the phone, and I get back on it and I said, "No, Sergeant Herrera, this is Matt Fyles over in gangs." Because I thought he must have gotten confused. they're asking me to come to homicide. I'm very young. I'm 29 at the time. And he says, and I'll use the language, but he says, "Motherfucker, I know who I called," right? And I'm like, okay, right? Okay. So I say, "Yes, sir. I will see you on Monday." And I'm like fretting over the weekend. And he calls me on Monday morning and he says, "We're going to postpone to Friday because they had another murder. And they were called out and he's too tired and wants to go home." And I'm like, "Great. Now I can punt to Friday." And in the meantime, I'm busy gaming, trying to figure out why my name is on the list because there are a plethora of like very seasoned older investigators that typically were the ones that would go to homicide, right? There's this like natural cycle to homicide. So I'm going around talking to all these guys going, "Why aren't you going? Why aren't you going?" Like, "I know they want you. I know they want you." And they all said the same thing. "Oh, yeah, they've called. There's no way in hell I'm going to homicide. I'm not working that hard. I have a family." And I'm like, okay, how do I get out of this? Right. So Friday comes along. It's 4 p.m. I go over to Sergeant Herrera's office. I sit down and we're having a nice conversation, and he's telling me about the assignment. And I'm throwing up roadblock after roadblock. I tell him, I don't have my own car. I have a take home car. He says, "Don't worry about it. We got take home cars." I said, "Well, I'm super young. I'm only 29. Like, that's not the normal progression." He says, "We want talented people." I said, "Okay. Um, my wife is considering leaving me, and I've been sleeping on the floor in my office." And he says, "Don't worry. If you need time off, we'll give it to you." And in the face of all of that, it finally dawns on me. And I said, "When are you expecting to make your decision?" And he says, "End of business today." And I look up at the clock and it's now 4:50, right? End of business is in 10 minutes. And it dawned on me, I don't have a choice. And I said, "I get the feeling I'm not being asked." And he says, "Maddie, we want you to want this." And I sat there and instead of like going home and having a conversation with my wife, what do? I respond, "When do I report?" And he said, 8 o'clock Monday morning. And that was that. I was in homicide. And I drove home and I told my wife, "I'm going to homicide." And she said, "Did they give you a choice?" And of course, I lied and said no. I mean, I was being voluntold, right? But I could have thrown a real fit.
Yeah,
But I thought
tough,
it
tough.
was pure suicide if I did. I'm 29 years old. The next oldest guy in homicide was 14 years older than me, right?
Wow.
This is unheard of. So how dare I turn this down?
Yep. Pressures between work and home. A
Yeah.
lot to navigate.
Yeah, and and when I say I drove home to tell my wife, it was because I was going home to see my daughter, not because I was welcome at home, right? So,
Yep.
here I am, literally sleeping on the floor of my office at the time over in gangs, and I think she felt bad for me in part, and it was that conversation that got me back in the house. Um, and it all it was doing is prolonging the inevitable, but yeah, I mean that's where I was at that point in my career.